The fork clattered against the ceramic plate like a gunshot in the silence. Every head at the dinner table turned toward the sound, but Marcus felt his world collapse in that single moment. His 22-year-old son Derek was laughing, actually laughing, at the way his own father held his utensils. "Jesus, Dad, you eat like some homeless guy who hasn't seen food in weeks," Derek snorted, his girlfriend Emma giggling beside him. "Maybe I should record this for social media. How not to eat at 68. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He had spent 40 minutes preparing this meal, Derek's favorite pot roast, the one he'd been making since the boy was 5 years old. The same recipe Marcus had learned from his own mother, back when families actually meant something. Back when children respected their parents instead of using them as entertainment. Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he set down his fork. The dining room felt suffocating suddenly, the walls pressing in around him. This was his house, his table, his food. He had worked 16-hour days for decades to afford this life, to give Derek everything he never had. And this was his reward. "Derek, that's enough," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. But Derek wasn't finished. Oh no, he was just getting started. The boy had an audience now. Emma and his 2 college buddies who'd come for dinner. Free food and entertainment, all courtesy of the old man. "I'm serious, Dad. Look at yourself. You're holding that fork like it's gonna run away from you," Derek demonstrated with exaggerated, shaky movements, making his friends burst into fresh laughter. "Maybe we should get you one of those sippy cups next. You know, the ones they make for—" "I said that's enough." Marcus's voice cut through the laughter like ice. The table went quiet, but Derek's eyes gleamed with something cruel, something that made Marcus's stomach turn. When had his son's eyes become so cold? When had the sweet little boy, who used to climb into his lap during thunderstorms, turned into this stranger who seemed to take pleasure in his father's humiliation? "What's wrong, Dad? Can't take a joke?" Derek leaned back in his chair, the chair Marcus had bought from his first bonus at the construction company 30 years ago. "You're always so serious. Emma here thinks you need to lighten up, don't you, babe?" Emma shifted uncomfortably, finally sensing that maybe this had gone too far. But she was young, barely 20, and completely under Derek's spell. She managed a weak smile and nodded. Marcus looked around the table at these young faces, faces that showed no respect, no understanding of what it meant to work until your hands bled to provide for your family. Faces that saw him as nothing more than a walking ATM and occasional source of amusement. His chest felt tight, not physically but emotionally, as if something inside him was slowly tearing apart. He had raised Derek alone since the boy was 7, after Derek's mother decided that being a wife and mother was too limiting for her artistic dreams. She'd left one Tuesday morning while Derek was at school, taking nothing but her clothes and the money from their joint account. Marcus had never remarried. Every relationship had ended the same way, women who claimed they loved him, until they realized he was a package deal. Until they understood that Derek would always come first, that Marcus would choose his son over anyone else, every single time. And now, 15 years later, this was his reward for that sacrifice. "You know what your problem is, Dad?" Derek continued, his voice getting louder as he fed off his friend's attention. "You never learned how to have fun. Mum was right about that. She always said you were boring as hell." The mention of Derek's mother was like a slap across Marcus's face. His ex-wife, who hadn't called or visited in 3 years, who sent birthday cards with $20 bills inside like Derek was still a child, who had never paid a dime in child support but somehow remained the cool parent in Derek's mind. Marcus stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor he'd installed himself the summer Derek turned 12. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. "Where are you going, Dad? Did we hurt your feelings?" Derek's voice dripped with mock concern, but there was something vicious underneath it. something that suggested he knew exactly how much damage he was inflicting and was enjoying every second of it. Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't trust his voice not to break, and he refused to give Derek the satisfaction of seeing him cry. Instead, he walked to the kitchen and began clearing the dishes. The dishes no one else would touch, the dishes he'd been washing alone for 15 years. Behind him, he could hear Derek's voice dropping to what he probably thought was a whisper. "He's so pathetic. I swear, sometimes I'm embarrassed to admit he's my father." The plate Marcus was holding slipped from his numb fingers and shattered against the kitchen floor. The sound seemed to echo forever in the silence that followed. Derek appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with alcohol and cruelty. "Great. Now look what you did. Can't even hold a stupid plate. Maybe I should call Mom and ask her to come take care of you." "Oh wait, she won't, because she knows what a loser you are too." Something inside Marcus died in that moment. Not dramatically, not with fanfare or tears. It simply stopped existing like a light bulb burning out. The part of him that had fought for this relationship, that had made excuses for Derek's behavior, that had convinced himself things would get better when the boy matured, it was just gone. Marcus looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger, a cruel, entitled stranger who had been living off his generosity while treating him like garbage. A stranger who had never learned the value of hard work, of respect, of simple human decency. "Clean it up," Marcus said quietly. "What?" Derek blinked, obviously not expecting this response. "I said clean it up. This is my house. You broke it, you clean it up." Derek laughed, but it sounded forced now. "Are you serious? It's just a plate, Dad. Relax. Clean it up." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Derek's friends had gathered in the doorway now, sensing drama but not understanding the seismic shift that had just occurred in this household. Derek's face hardened. "No, I'm not your maid, old man. Clean it up yourself. That's what you're good for anyway." Marcus nodded slowly, as if Derek had just confirmed something he'd suspected for a long time. Without another word, he walked past his son, past the gawking college kids, and up the stairs to his bedroom. He sat on the edge of his bed, the bed he'd slept in alone for 15 years, and stared at the framed photo on his nightstand. Derek at age 7, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a Father's Day card he'd made at school. "World's best dad," it had said in crayon letters. Marcus picked up the photo and studied it carefully, trying to find some trace of that sweet little boy in the cruel young man downstairs. But all he could see was a stranger who happened to share his DNA. From downstairs came the sound of laughter and music. Derek and his friends had apparently moved on from the dinner drama and were now treating his house like their personal party venue. No one had cleaned up the broken plate. No one had even bothered to put away the food. Marcus opened his laptop and began typing. First, an email to the bank, canceling Derek's access to the college fund account. $23,000 that Marcus had saved, dollar by dollar, working overtime and skipping meals to build his son's future. Then he opened another document, his will. Derek's name appeared 17 times throughout the pages, inheriting everything from the house to Marcus's retirement accounts. Marcus selected the text and pressed delete. It took him less than 10 minutes to remove his son from his entire life. The laughter from downstairs grew louder, and Marcus could hear Derek's voice above the rest, probably telling another cruel story about his pathetic father. But for the first time in years, Marcus felt something like peace settling over him. Tomorrow, Derek would learn what it meant to stand on his own 2 feet. Tomorrow, the gravy train would officially derail. Tonight, Marcus would mourn the death of the relationship he'd thought they had and prepare for the life he was going to build without his ungrateful son in it. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the dinner that changed everything. Derek stood in his apartment doorway, still in yesterday's clothes, staring at the official document like it was written in a foreign language. 30 days, he read aloud, his voice hoarse from the previous night's party. Due to non-payment of rent for the months of... The words blurred together as the reality hit him. His father had actually done it. The old man had actually cut him off, just like that, over some stupid dinner conversation. Derek had been so sure it was a bluff, just another one of his dad's empty threats designed to make him feel guilty. But the bank statements didn't lie. The automatic deposits had stopped. The credit card was maxed out and frozen. The college fund account that had always been his safety net was suddenly and completely empty. "This is insane," Derek muttered, fumbling for his phone. He'd tried calling his father every day for the past 3 weeks, but Marcus never answered. The old man was really committed to this ridiculous tantrum. Derek scrolled through his contacts until he found his mother's number. Jennifer had been living in California for the past 5 years, pursuing her art career and her 3rd marriage. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice distracted and slightly annoyed. "Derek, what's wrong? I'm in the middle of a gallery showing." "Mom, I need help. Dad's lost his mind. He cut me off completely, cancelled everything. I'm about to get evicted." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Derek could hear voices in the background, the clink of wine glasses, the sound of his mother's new life, a life that had never included room for him. "What did you do?" Jennifer asked finally. "Nothing. We had dinner. I made a few jokes and he completely overreacted. You know how sensitive he is." Another pause. Longer this time. "Derek, your father isn't the type to overreact about anything. What exactly did you say to him?" Derek felt his face flush. Even through the phone, his mother could make him feel like a child caught lying. "It wasn't that bad. I commented on how he eats. It was funny. You made fun of your father, the man who raised you single-handedly for 15 years, the man who worked himself half to death to give you everything you wanted." The disappointment in her voice was worse than if she'd yelled at him. Derek had always counted on his mother taking his side, especially against his father. They'd bonded over Marcus's supposed shortcomings for years. "Mum, you don't understand. He was being so embarrassing in front of my friends. I mean, the way he holds his fork is just..." "Stop!" Jennifer's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Just stop talking, Derek. You sound like a spoiled brat." Derek felt like he'd been slapped. "Mom, I'm your son. I need your help here. And Marcus is the father of my child, the man I should have appreciated more when I had the chance." Her voice softened slightly, but not in the way Derek had hoped. "I can't help you, sweetheart. I don't have the money, and even if I did, maybe your father is right. Maybe it's time you learned to stand on your own 2 feet. The line went dead, leaving Derek staring at his phone in disbelief. Even his mother, his fun, artistic, free-spirited mother, who had always been on his side, was taking the old man's side now. Derek threw his phone across the room, where it bounced off the wall and clattered to the floor. The apartment suddenly felt impossibly small, the walls closing in around him. This was supposed to be temporary, just a phase where his father taught him some kind of lesson about respect or gratitude or whatever. It wasn't supposed to be real, but the eviction notice in his hand was very real. The empty bank account was real. The maxed-out credit cards were real. For the first time in his 22 years, Derek was completely and utterly alone. He spent the next week trying everything he could think of. He begged his college friends for loans, but they were all broke students living off their own parents' money. He applied for jobs, but every interview ended the same way. Employers asking about his work experience, his references, his skills. Derek had none of these things. He'd never needed them before. His girlfriend Emma lasted exactly 4 days before she moved on to someone with better prospects. "I'm sorry, Derek," she'd said, not looking sorry at all. I just can't be with someone who doesn't have their life together. By the end of the month, Derek was sleeping on friends' couches, carrying everything he owned in 2 duffel bags. The apartment he'd lived in for 3 years, the apartment his father had paid for without complaint, was now home to someone else. Derek found himself walking through the old neighborhood, the one where he'd grown up. His feet carried him down familiar streets, past the house where his best friend from elementary school used to live, past the corner store where his father had bought him ice cream every Friday after school. And then he was standing in front of his childhood home, looking up at the windows of the only real home he'd ever known. The house looked different somehow, smaller than he remembered, older. The garden his father had always maintained was overgrown, weeds pushing through the cracks in the walkway. Derek stood there for a long time, working up the courage to knock on the door. This was his father, after all. The man who had taught him to ride a bike, who had stayed up all night when Derek had pneumonia, who had never missed a single school event or baseball game. Surely there was still some love left between them, some foundation they could rebuild on. The door opened before Derek could knock, and his father stood there looking older than Derek remembered. Marcus was wearing work clothes, his hands stained with motor oil, his face carefully neutral. Derek. Dad. Derek's voice cracked like he was 12 years old again. Can we talk? Marcus stepped aside without a word, and Derek followed him into the house. Everything was exactly as he remembered it, except for one crucial detail. There were no photos of Derek anywhere. The mantle that had once displayed his school pictures and graduation photos was now bare, except for a single plant. It was like Derek had been erased from the house entirely. "You want some coffee?" Marcus asked, his voice polite but distant, like Derek was a stranger who'd knocked on his door asking for directions. "Dad, I'm sorry." The words tumbled out of Derek's mouth before he could stop them. "I know I screwed up at dinner. I know I said things I shouldn't have said, but this is crazy. You're destroying my entire life over one stupid conversation." Marcus poured 2 cups of coffee, his movements careful and deliberate. When he turned around, his eyes were sad but resolved. "Derek, do you remember what you said to me that night?" Derek shifted uncomfortably. "I made some jokes. Maybe they went too far, but you said I was pathetic. You said you were embarrassed to admit I was your father." Marcus's voice was steady, but Derek could see the pain flickering in his eyes. "You said your mother was right about me being a loser." The words hung in the air between them, and Derek suddenly saw them for what they really were. Not jokes, not harmless teasing, but deliberate cruelty designed to hurt the man who had given him everything. "I didn't mean it," Derek whispered. Marcus nodded slowly. "I know you didn't mean it the way it sounded. But Derek, the fact that those words came out of your mouth at all tells me something important. It tells me that somewhere deep down, that's how you really see me." Derek wanted to argue, to protest, to explain that he'd just been showing off for his friends, but the words wouldn't come because there was a terrible kernel of truth in what his father was saying. Derek had always taken Marcus for granted, had always seen him as boring, predictable, uncool. "I raised you alone for 15 years, Marcus continued, his voice getting stronger. "I gave you everything I could, sacrificed everything I wanted, and somewhere along the way, I forgot to teach you the most important lesson of all." "What lesson?" Marcus looked at his son with something that might have been pity. "That respect isn't given because someone loves you. It's earned through your actions, and it's kept through your character." Derek felt tears burning his eyes. "So that's it? You're going to let me be homeless because I hurt your feelings?" "No, Derek. I'm going to let you learn what it means to be a man, what it means to work for what you want, to treat people with dignity, to understand that actions have consequences." Marcus walked to the kitchen counter and picked up an envelope. Inside were several job applications already filled out with Derek's information. These are all entry-level positions. Nothing glamorous, nothing easy. But they're honest work, and they'll teach you what I should have taught you years ago. Derek stared at the applications like they were a death sentence. Grocery store clerk, fast food worker, warehouse assistant. These weren't the kinds of jobs he'd imagined for himself. These were the jobs for people who hadn't been smart enough for college, for people who hadn't had the advantages he'd had. Dad, I can't. I mean, what would people think? What would Emma think? Marcus's expression hardened slightly. Emma left you the minute your money ran out, didn't she? Derek's silence was answer enough. Son, the people whose opinions matter won't think less of you for doing honest work, and the people who do think less of you, well, their opinions don't matter. Derek took the applications with shaking hands. This wasn't how his life was supposed to go. He was supposed to graduate college, get some high-paying job through connections, maybe take over his father's business someday. He wasn't supposed to be wearing a uniform and saying, "Would you like fries with that?" But as he looked around the house that no longer felt like home, at the father who now felt like a stranger, Derek realized he didn't have any other choice. The easy life was over. The real one was about to begin. The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m., jolting Derek from the restless sleep he'd finally managed to find on his friend Jake's couch. His entire body ached from the unfamiliar sensation of physical labor. 8 hours of unloading delivery trucks at the warehouse had revealed muscles he never knew he had. Derek rolled off the couch, trying not to wake Jake's roommates, who had made it clear his welcome was wearing thin. 2 weeks of living out of duffel bags, rotating between different couches, had stripped away the last of his illusions about how good his friendships really were. The warehouse job paid barely above minimum wage, but it was the only place that had called him back after the humiliating rounds of interviews. Derek had sat across from managers who were younger than him, trying to explain why a 22-year-old college student had zero work experience. "I was focused on my studies," he'd said, the lie tasting bitter in his mouth. The truth was he'd been focused on parties, on girls, on spending his father's money without a second thought. The shower at Jake's apartment was broken, so Derek splashed cold water on his face at the kitchen sink and pulled on the same work clothes he'd worn yesterday. Everything smelled like sweat and cardboard dust, but laundromat visits cost money he couldn't spare. His phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Dude, you need to find somewhere else to crash. Sarah's getting pissed about you being here all the time." Derek stared at the message, his stomach dropping. Jake had been his best friend since freshman year, the guy who'd always had his back, always been down for whatever scheme or adventure Derek had cooked up. But apparently friendship had limits, especially when it involved actual inconvenience. The warehouse supervisor, a weathered man named Carl, who looked like he'd been born holding a clipboard, barely glanced up when Derek clocked in. "You're on loading dock 3 today. Truck comes in at 6, needs to be cleared by noon." Derek nodded and trudged toward his assignment, joining the handful of other workers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Most of them were older, men in their 40s and 50s who'd probably been doing this kind of work their whole lives. They looked at Derek with a mixture of amusement and disdain, recognizing immediately that he didn't belong here. The truck was massive, packed floor to ceiling with boxes that needed to be unloaded, sorted, and stacked. Derek's soft hands, which had never done anything more demanding than typing papers or playing video games, were already covered in blisters from his first week. "College boy!" Carl's voice cracked like a whip across the loading dock. "Move your ass! This ain't a yoga class!" Derek's face burned with embarrassment as the other workers snickered. Back in college, he'd been somebody. He'd been the guy with the nice clothes and the expensive car, the one who could afford to pick up the tab when his friends were short on cash. Now he was just another grunt, and not even a very good one. The morning dragged by in a haze of repetitive motion and aching muscles. Lift, carry, stack, lift, carry, stack. The boxes seemed to get heavier with each passing hour, and Derek's shoulders screamed in protest. By lunch break, he could barely lift his arms above his head. He sat alone in the break room, eating a peanut butter sandwich he'd made from the discount bread and off-brand peanut butter that were all he could afford. Around him, the other workers talked and laughed, but Derek wasn't part of their world. He was the college kid playing dress-up, pretending to be a working man. His phone rang, and Derek's heart jumped when he saw his father's name on the screen. They hadn't spoken since that awful conversation in the kitchen 3 weeks ago. "Hello?" Derek's voice was hoarse from calling out inventory numbers all morning. "Derek!" Marcus's voice was neutral, giving nothing away. "How are you doing?" The simple question hit Derek like a physical blow. How was he doing? He was homeless, friendless, working a job that was slowly destroying his body for wages that barely covered food. He was everything he'd sworn he'd never become. I'm managing," Derek lied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I heard you got a job at the warehouse." Derek wasn't surprised, his father knew. This was a small community, and news traveled fast. "Yeah, it's not much, but it's honest work, right?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Derek, I want you to know that I'm proud of you." The words hit Derek like a truck. Proud? His father was proud of him for loading boxes for 8 hours a day, for sleeping on couches and eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. "Dad, You're learning something important," Marcus continued. "You're learning what it means to earn what you get. That's more valuable than any college degree." Derek felt tears burning his eyes, but he blinked them back. He was in a warehouse break room surrounded by strangers. He couldn't break down now. "Dad, I need to ask you something." Derek's voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you think, is there any chance we could I come home? Just until I get back on my feet?" The silence stretched so long, Derek thought the call had been disconnected. "Derek," Marcus said finally, "you are on your feet. Maybe for the first time in your life." The line went dead, leaving Derek staring at his phone in the fluorescent-lit break room that smelled like industrial cleaner and other people's lunches. That afternoon, Derek's supervisor informed him that his productivity was below standard and he'd need to pick up the pace or find another job. The threat wasn't idle. Derek had already seen 3 other workers get fired in his short time there. After his shift, Derek walked the streets instead of going back to Jake's apartment. He couldn't face another night on that couch, another morning of apologetic texts about overstaying his welcome. His feet carried him through the old neighborhood again, past the house where he'd grown up. The windows were dark, his father probably already asleep in preparation for another early morning at his construction job. Marcus had been getting up at dawn for 30 years, building other people's dreams with his own 2 hands. Derek had never appreciated that sacrifice, had never understood what it meant to trade your body's comfort for your family's security. Derek found himself at the small park where his father had taught him to throw a baseball. The swings were empty, creaking slightly in the evening breeze. Derek sat on one of them, his adult frame making the child-sized seat uncomfortable. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, looking for someone, anyone, who might let him crash for another night. But the list of options was shrinking rapidly. College friends who'd seemed so loyal 6 months ago were suddenly unavailable, too busy with their own lives to help him through his crisis. As the sun set, Derek made a decision that would have horrified his 6 weeks ago self. He walked to the local homeless shelter, swallowing his pride as he approached the front desk. "I need a place to sleep tonight," he told the volunteer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and calloused hands. She looked him up and down, taking in his work clothes and exhausted posture. "First time?" Derek nodded, not trusting his voice. "You're not the first college kid to end up here," she said gently. "Won't be the last. There's a cot available in the men's section. Dinner's at 6 if you're hungry." The shelter was exactly what Derek had expected. Institutional walls, the smell of disinfectant barely masking other, less pleasant odors, men of all ages dealing with circumstances that had brought them to this place. Some were clearly struggling with addiction or mental health issues. Others, like Derek, just looked tired and defeated. Derek lay on his assigned cot, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of dozens of other people who had nowhere else to go. For the first time since this nightmare began, he allowed himself to really think about what he'd lost. Not just the money, though, that had been devastating. Not just the comfortable apartment or the easy college lifestyle. He'd lost his father's respect, his friends' loyalty, his girlfriend's affection. He'd lost the future he'd always assumed was waiting for him. But lying there in that shelter, surrounded by people who had lost far more than he had, Derek began to understand something his father had been trying to teach him. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a different one. Tomorrow he'd get up at 4:30 again. He'd go to the warehouse and lift boxes until his back screamed. He'd come home to the shelter and eat whatever they were serving in the dining hall. And slowly, painfully, he'd build something new from the ruins of his old life. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be comfortable. But for the first time in weeks, Derek felt something that had been missing since that awful dinner: hope. He was finally learning what his father had been trying to teach him all along. That respect wasn't something you inherited. It was something you earned, one day at a time, one honest hour's work at a time. And maybe, if he worked hard enough and long enough, he might earn back the one thing that mattered most: his father's love. 6 months had passed since Derek's first night at the shelter, and the man looking back at him from the bathroom mirror was almost unrecognizable. Gone was the soft, pampered college student who'd never known a day of real work. In his place stood someone harder, leaner, with calloused hands and tired eyes that had seen things he'd never imagined. Derek had been promoted to shift supervisor at the warehouse, a position that came with a small raise and a lot more responsibility. The same men who'd laughed at him 6 months ago now looked to him for direction, impressed despite themselves by his work ethic and determination to prove himself. More importantly, Derek had saved enough money to rent a tiny studio apartment in the least desirable part of town. It wasn't much, 400 square feet with a kitchen that barely deserved the name, but it was his. The first thing he'd bought after the security deposit was a bed frame, tired of sleeping on a mattress on the floor like a college freshman. The apartment was sparse, furnished with items from thrift stores and garage sales, but every piece of furniture, every plate and cup and towel had been earned through his own sweat and sacrifice. There was a pride in that ownership that Derek had never experienced when everything had been handed to him. His phone rarely rang anymore. The college friends who'd once surrounded him had graduated and moved on to careers funded by their parents' connections. Emma was dating someone new, a business major whose father owned a chain of restaurants. Derek had seen the announcement on social media, along with photos of expensive dinners and weekend trips that his former self would have envied. But the loneliness wasn't as sharp as it had been in those first, desperate weeks. Derek had learned to find satisfaction in simpler things. A job well done, a paycheck earned honestly, the quiet pride of standing on his own 2 feet. Still, there was one relationship that remained broken, one wound that time hadn't healed. Derek thought about his father every day, wondered if Marcus ever thought about him. They lived in the same small town, shopped at the same stores, but they might as well have been on different planets. Derek had driven past his childhood home countless times, always slowing down, always hoping to catch a glimpse of his father in the yard or at the window, But Marcus seemed to have developed a sixth sense for avoiding his son. Or maybe Derek was just unlucky with his timing. The call came on a Thursday evening while Derek was heating up a can of soup for dinner. His supervisor's voice was urgent, apologetic. "Derek, I know it's your night off, but we've got an emergency. The overnight crew called in sick, some kind of food poisoning from the diner down the street. Can you come in? Double time for the whole shift." Derek didn't hesitate. Double time meant he could finally afford to buy a decent winter coat instead of layering 3 thin jackets. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The warehouse at night was a different beast entirely. The daytime chaos of trucks and shouting supervisors gave way to an eerie quiet, broken only by the hum of machinery and the echo of footsteps on concrete floors. Derek worked alone, methodically processing the inventory that had backed up during the day shift. It was nearly midnight when he heard the commotion outside, raised voices, the screech of brakes, the distinctive wail of emergency sirens. Derek looked out through the loading dock doors and saw the flashing lights of an ambulance and fire truck gathered around a construction site across the street. Derek's blood went cold. He recognized that site. It was the shopping center renovation his father's company had been working on. Marcus had mentioned it months ago, back when they were still talking, describing it as the biggest contract his small crew had ever landed. Without thinking, Derek abandoned his post and ran across the street. The scene was controlled chaos, paramedics loading someone into an ambulance while firefighters worked to stabilize a partially collapsed scaffolding structure. "What happened?" Derek asked one of the construction workers, a man he vaguely recognized from around town. "Scaffolding gave way," the worker replied grimly. Marcus was working late, trying to finish the exterior work before the weather turns. "Whole thing came down on him." Derek's world tilted sideways. How bad is it?" "Bad enough. They're taking him to the medical center downtown." Derek ran back to the warehouse, grabbed his keys, and drove through the empty streets like a man possessed. The hospital emergency room was harsh with fluorescent lighting and the smell of antiseptic. Derek approached the reception desk, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Marcus Peterson," he said to the tired-looking nurse. "He was brought in from a construction accident. I'm his son." The nurse checked her computer, then looked up with the carefully neutral expression healthcare workers used when delivering difficult news. "He's in surgery right now. The doctor will speak with family members when he's finished." Derek spent the next 4 hours in the worst chairs ever designed, drinking coffee that tasted like it had been brewed with battery acid and watching the clock crawl forward. Other families came and went, but Derek sat alone with his guilt and his fear and his regret. At 4:17 a.m., a surgeon in scrubs that looked like they'd been through a war zone finally approached him. Dr. Martinez was a small woman with tired eyes and steady hands. "Mr. Peterson?" she asked, and Derek nodded. "Your father is stable, but his injuries are extensive. 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, severe lacerations on his left arm, and a concussion. He's lucky to be alive." Derek felt his knees go weak with relief. "Can I see him?" "He's sedated right now, but you can sit with him, room 314. Derek took the elevator up with shaking hands, trying to prepare himself for what he would find. But nothing could have prepared him for the sight of his father, strong, invincible Marcus, lying small and broken in that hospital bed, connected to tubes and monitors that beeped with mechanical precision. Derek pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, studying his father's face. Marcus looked older than Derek remembered, lines of pain and exhaustion etched around his eyes even in sleep. When had his hair gotten so gray? When had his hands become so weathered? "I'm sorry, Dad," Derek whispered into the quiet room. "I'm so sorry for everything." Marcus didn't respond, lost in whatever dreams the medication had given him. But Derek kept talking, pouring out months of regret and newfound understanding into the space between them. I know what you were trying to teach me now. I know why you cut me off, why you made me figure it out on my own. I was spoiled and cruel, and I took everything you gave me for granted. I treated you like you owed me something, like your love was something I could abuse without consequences. Derek's voice cracked, but he kept going. I have a job now, a real job. I wake up at 4:30 every morning and I work until my hands bleed and my back aches. And you know what? I'm proud of it. I'm proud of earning my own way, of paying my own rent, of knowing that everything I have came from my own sweat. He reached out, tentatively, and touched his father's bandaged hand. I understand now why you worked so hard all those years, why you came home exhausted every night but still helped me with my homework. Why you never complained when I needed new clothes, or wanted to go on school trips, or asked for money for things I didn't even need. The monitors continued their steady beeping, the only sound in the room besides Derek's whispered confession. I know I hurt you. I know I said things that can't be taken back, but if you can find it in your heart to forgive me, I want to make it right. I want to be the son you deserved all along. Derek stayed in that chair until the sun came up, watching his father breathe, praying to a God he'd never paid much attention to before. When the nurses came for their morning rounds, they found Derek asleep with his head on the edge of the hospital bed, one hand still touching his father's arm. Sir? The nurse's voice was gentle but insistent. Visiting hours ended at midnight. You need to... He's my son. Marcus's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed earlier that morning. Let him stay. Derek's eyes snapped open, and he found himself looking into his father's face, pale, bruised, but undeniably alive and aware. Dad? Marcus tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. You look terrible, Derek laughed, a sound caught somewhere between relief and hysteria. You should see yourself. They stared at each other for a long moment, 6 months of silence and hurt hanging between them like a wall. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his voice stronger now. The nurse told me you've been here all night. Derek nodded. I heard about the accident at work. I came as soon as I could. Work? Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly. They told me you were at the warehouse when it happened. Night shift? Emergency call-in. Overtime pay. Derek felt heat rise in his cheeks, suddenly self-conscious about his minimum wage job in the face of his father's near-death experience. But Marcus's expression wasn't judgmental. If anything, he looked impressed. You're working nights now, too? Just when they need extra help. I'm trying to save up for... Derek trailed off, realizing how trivial his goals sounded in the sterile reality of the hospital room. For what? Derek took a deep breath. A truck. Nothing fancy, just something reliable that won't break down when I need to get to work. And maybe someday I could go back to school, part-time while I'm working. Business classes or something practical. Marcus studied his son's face, taking in the changes that 6 months of real life had wrought. The soft edges were gone, replaced by something harder, but somehow more genuine. Derek's hands were rough now, his clothes simple and worn but clean. He looked like a man who understood the value of $1 because he'd had to earn every one. Derek, Marcus said slowly, I need to tell you something. Derek's heart clenched, fearing his father was about to deliver some terrible news about his injuries, about permanent damage or long-term disability. I never stopped loving you, Marcus continued. Not for 1 second, even when I was so angry I couldn't see straight. Everything I did, cutting you off, forcing you out, it wasn't because I didn't love you. It was because I loved you too much to watch you become someone I couldn't respect. Tears Derek had been holding back for months finally spilled over. Dad, I'm so sorry. The things I said at dinner, the way I treated you. You were a kid who'd never learned what it meant to struggle for anything, Marcus interrupted gently. That was my fault as much as yours. I wanted to give you everything I never had, but I forgot to give you the one thing that mattered most. What's that? The satisfaction of earning something yourself. The pride that comes from knowing you can stand on your own 2 feet, no matter what life throws at you. Derek wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, not caring that he was crying in front of his father for the first time since he was a child. I have that now. It's been the hardest 6 months of my life, but also, I don't know how to explain it. I'm proud of who I'm becoming. Marcus reached out with his uninjured hand and squeezed Derek's shoulder. I'm proud of who you're becoming too. The simple words carried more weight than any inheritance, any trust fund, any material gift Marcus could have given his son. Derek felt something inside his chest, something that had been broken since that awful dinner, finally begin to heal. Dad, can I ask you something? Anything. Derek hesitated, then plunged ahead. When you get out of here, when you're recovered, would you maybe want to have dinner? I mean, I can't cook anything fancy, but I make a decent spaghetti. And I promise I'll hold my fork the right way. Marcus laughed, actually laughed for the first time in 6 months. It hurt his broken ribs, but he didn't care. I'd like that very much. Derek smiled through his tears. And Dad, next time I'll do the dishes. 3 months later, Derek stood in the small kitchen of his studio apartment, stirring a pot of marinara sauce and trying not to burn the garlic bread in his ancient toaster oven. The apartment looked different now. Still small, still humble, but cleaner and more organized. Derek had bought a small dining table from a yard sale and spent 2 weekends refinishing it himself, watching YouTube videos to learn how to sand and stain wood properly. His father was coming to dinner for the first time since the hospital, and Derek wanted everything to be perfect. Not impressive or expensive, just perfect in the way that mattered, prepared with care, served with love, shared between 2 people who had found their way back to each other. Marcus knocked at exactly 6 o'clock. The punctuality Derek remembered from childhood when his father had never been late to a single school event or baseball game. Derek opened the door to find his father standing there with a small bouquet of flowers from the grocery store and a nervous smile. For the table, Marcus said, offering the flowers. I know it's not much, but they're perfect, Dad. Come in. Marcus stepped into the apartment, his eyes taking in the small space that Derek had worked so hard to make into a home. The furniture was mismatched and obviously second-hand, but everything was clean and carefully arranged. Books from the library were stacked neatly on a makeshift shelf. A small plant, Derek's first attempt at keeping something alive, sat on the windowsill. This is nice, Derek. Really nice. Derek felt a flush of pride. It's not much, but it's mine, you know. Marcus nodded, understanding completely. Sometimes the things we work hardest for mean the most. They sat down at the small table, and Derek served the spaghetti with hands that only shook a little. The sauce was good, not great, but edible, and the garlic bread was only slightly burned on one side. Marcus ate with genuine appreciation, complimenting the meal like it was something from a 5-star restaurant. So how's the physical therapy going? Derek asked, noting how his father favored his left arm, still healing from the surgery to repair the damage from his accident. Better every week. Doctor says I'll be back to full strength in another month or 2. Marcus paused, twirling spaghetti around his fork with practiced ease. Actually, that's something I wanted to talk to you about. Derek looked up, concerned. What do you mean? Well, the accident made me think about some things. About getting older, about what happens to the business when I can't do the physical work anymore. Marcus met his son's eyes across the small table. I've been thinking about taking on a partner. Someone I could teach the business side to while I handle more of the management and customer relations. Derek's heart began to race, but he tried not to get his hopes up. That sounds like a smart plan. The thing is, It would have to be someone I trust completely, someone who understands the value of hard work, who's proven they can stick with something even when it gets difficult. Marcus set down his fork and looked directly at Derek. Someone who's learned what it means to earn respect instead of expecting it. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and hope. "Dad, are you offering me a job?" Marcus shook his head, and Derek's heart sank for a moment before his father continued. "I'm not offering you a job, Derek. I'm offering you an opportunity to build something with me, to learn a trade that no one can ever take away from you, in a business that could be yours someday if you want it." Derek felt tears stinging his eyes again. 6 months ago, the idea of working construction would have horrified him. It was blue-collar work, the kind of job he'd been raised to think he was too good for. But now, having learned the satisfaction of earning his own way, the thought of building something real with his hands and with his father sounded like the greatest opportunity in the world. "I don't know anything about construction," Derek said honestly. "You didn't know anything about warehouse work either, but you figured it out. You showed up every day, worked hard, earned a promotion. That tells me everything I need to know about what kind of man you've become." Derek thought about his life over the past 9 months, the humiliation of that dinner, the desperation of sleeping in shelters, the slow, painful process of building something from nothing. Every callus on his hands, every aching muscle, every small victory had led to this moment. "I'd have to give my supervisor notice at the warehouse. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Marcus smiled. "That's exactly what I'd expect you to say. A man honors his commitments." They finished dinner in comfortable conversation, talking about the business, about Derek's ideas for improving efficiency, about the future they might build together. When Derek cleared the dishes, keeping his promise from the hospital, Marcus followed him to the small kitchen. "Derek, I need to tell you something else." Derek looked up from the sink, soap suds on his hands. "I put your name back in my will last month." Derek's hands stilled in the soapy water. "Dad, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did. Not because you're my son, though you are. Not because I love you, though I do. I did it because you've proven you're the kind of man who deserves to inherit something meaningful. You've learned that wealth isn't just money. It's character, integrity, the ability to stand on your own feet and help others do the same." Derek turned around, drying his hands on a dish towel that had seen better days. "I don't want your money, Dad. I mean, I'm grateful, but that's not why I changed. I changed because I finally understood what you were trying to teach me." Marcus pulled his son into a hug, carefully, mindful of his still healing injuries, but firmly enough to convey everything he couldn't put into words. "I know that's not why you changed. That's exactly why you deserve to inherit something." They stood in that tiny kitchen, two men who had lost each other and found their way back through pain and pride and the kind of love that demands the best from both parties. Outside, traffic moved through the night streets of their small town, people heading home from work or out for the evening, living their own complicated lives full of broken relationships and second chances. "Dad?" Derek said as they separated. "Yeah? Thank you. Not for the job offer or the will or any of that. Thank you for loving me enough to let me fall, and for being there when I was ready to get back up." Marcus smiled, and for the first time in almost a year, it reached his eyes completely. "That's what fathers do, son. We teach our children to fly by showing them it's okay to fall first." Derek walked his father to the door, and they made plans for Derek to visit the construction site the following week to start learning the business from the ground up. As Marcus drove away, Derek stood in his doorway, looking out at the neighborhood he'd once been too proud to live in. His phone buzzed with a text from his warehouse supervisor. "Heard about your dad's offer. Proud of you, kid. You'll do great." Derek smiled, realizing that respect, real respect, came from unexpected places when you earned it honestly. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from spoiled college student to homeless shelter resident to warehouse worker to whatever came next. Tomorrow he would give his notice at the warehouse, thanking them for the opportunity that had taught him what he was capable of when he had no choice but to succeed. Next week, he would start learning construction from his father, building things that would last long after both of them were gone. But tonight, he would sit in his small, humble, hard-earned apartment and feel something he'd never experienced when everything was handed to him: complete satisfaction with the man he'd chosen to become. The dinner plates were clean, put away in cabinets he'd bought with his own money. The flowers his father had brought sat in a water glass on the refinished table, brightening the simple room. And for the first time since that awful night 9 months ago, Derek felt like he was exactly where he belonged. He had lost everything that didn't matter and found everything that did. And tomorrow, he would start building a future worthy of the man his father had always believed he could become. What do you think was the most powerful moment in Derek's transformation? Was it the night in the shelter, working his first day at the warehouse, or that final dinner with his father? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear which part of this journey resonated most with you. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible stories about family, redemption, and second chances. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more powerful content like this. What story should I tell next?